couple of years ago, when my son was born, I had to take some documents from the hospital to the state registry to get his birth certificate. And as I was filling out a form with the standard information, name, date of birth, place of birth, and so on, I noticed some fine print right above where I was supposed to sign. It cited such and such law and said that I was henceforth legally responsible for the well-being of this child and punishable by law if something were to happen to him. Legally responsible, punishable by law. I have to admit that I stopped for a second. And now, don't rush to judge me. I mean, I knew for having a child, I was morally responsible for the well-being of this baby, but I haven't stopped to think about being legally responsible, subject to punishment by law. Now, I don't know, have any of you noticed, the parents in the audience, have you noticed this writing on the form? Do they perhaps have two kinds of forms at the state registry? If a responsible, experienced-looking guy walks in, they give him Form A. If someone like me walks in, the first time they say, Form B for that one. Anyway, so there was this thought, legally responsible, morally responsible, and I've been working in the area of corporate responsibility for years now. So this concept of responsibility is something that I want to talk to you about today. Now, the origins of the word responsibility lie in Latin. And it's interesting to note that the word only began to come into everyday usage in many languages in the late 18th century, relatively recently. Also, I'm sure you've noticed that the word responsibility contains the concept of response, and not just in English, in many languages. So essentially, the idea developed when something happened somewhere, and someone asked, hey, what happened here? Why? And the person who was responsible for that had to answer that question. Now, if you delve into philosophy, it's the concept of moral responsibility that philosophers seem to be most interested in. Probably the other aspects of responsibility are too straightforward for it. So a philosopher might pose the following hypothetical situation to talk about the concept of moral responsibility. And this is a real topic from a real philosophy discussion board online. So the situation is this: suppose a bear breaks into your apartment and destroys everything you have. Would you hold that bear morally responsible for what happened? Now, if you're a non-philosopher like me, I'll give you a hint. The answer is no. But the question goes, what if a fellow human being did the same thing, broke into your apartment, damaged your stuff? The answer then, from a philosophical point of view, is it depends on whether that person did so of his or her own free will. So philosophers tie this concept of moral responsibility with freedom of choice, which I, as a layman, find very, very interesting. If you have a choice to make, and you have complete freedom to make it, then whatever happens as a consequence of the choice that you make is your responsibility. So let's make it political for just a moment. Suppose there's an election, and there are two parties, and I vote for Party A. Party A wins, but they're horrible at ruling the country. Am I responsible for this in any way? Suppose Party B wins, and they're horrible at ruling the country. Is my responsibility in this case 0%? Suppose Party B wins, but there are widespread allegations of fraud. To what extent am I responsible for what transpires in my country if I decide to do nothing? Let's stop making it political now and go back a few centuries in the past. Think about how people talk about this concept over the years. So, in the past, people would look to the stars, think about concepts like fate or a higher power, and very often that's where the blame would go, where the responsibility would go. Things happen because the stars had destined for them to happen in that way. And even today, we talk about destiny very often. But when we use a phrase like, why do these things always happen to me? What we're implying is that it's something else that is doing the happening, that we have no control over that something else, and therefore we have no responsibility for what happened. Sigmund Freud focused on the link between freedom and responsibility when he said, most people don't want freedom because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. So if we look back over the centuries at the revolutions, the changes in power, societal change, and so on, is this the universal truth behind them? In those situations, did a bunch of people suddenly lose their fear of responsibility and decided to raise their voices and demand freedom? While we're on the topic of choice and responsibility, I think it's worth making the point that we are today in a world where we're faced with a lot more choices, a lot more options, than we were 100 or 150 years ago. For example, something as simple as buying toothpaste. If you wanted to buy toothpaste 150 years ago, you probably only had just one choice, if any, depending on where you lived. Today, you can walk into a store and you have tens, sometimes hundreds of different things to choose. Let's talk about something a little more serious. How about choosing a partner for life, your spouse, the person you're going to marry, in your case? 150 years ago, in many societies, it was the parents who chose for the children. And that continues in some societies today. But even if you had freedom of choice 150 years ago, you were probably limited to your community, your village, your town, maybe your country, depending on who you were, but very rarely could you go beyond those borders and choose a partner for life from beyond. Today, of course, you can choose anyone, potentially, from any corner of the globe. So you're faced with a choice of billions of people from whom you have to pick that one person who's going to be with you till the end of your life. And so you have that scale of responsibility when it comes to that kind of life-making or life-breaking decision today. I mean, our parents and our grandparents, they've always wanted us to grow up to be responsible people. But little did they know that just the nature of the world that we live in today has put a whole new scale of responsibility on our shoulders, one that they could never have even imagined in their time. Another interesting quote about responsibility comes from, depending on when you were born, comes from either Voltaire or Spider-Man's uncle. Now, I don't know if I'm allowed to reference Spider-Man's uncle on a TEDx stage. They have license issues. But both Voltaire and Uncle Ben said essentially the same thing. With power comes responsibility. Also quoted in the Bible as, to whom much is given, much more is asked in return. So, what happens if you're born into this power? Did you really have a choice? All the freedom of choice and the responsibility that comes with choice that we talked about earlier? Or are we making the assumption that if you don't give up this power, if you don't abdicate the throne, if you don't donate all that wealth to charity, that's when you're deciding to keep the power and all the responsibility that comes with it? Now, I like this relationship between power and responsibility because it allows me to divert the talk slightly into the area of corporate responsibility, my day job. Now, the concept of corporate responsibility began to gather steam in the 1990s when some people in some organizations saw businesses doing something in one corner of the globe and they disseminated that through this new thing called the internet. And a bunch of people saw that and said, hey, what's going on here and why? And the corporations that were responsible for what happened had to answer that question. So corporate responsibility evolved in much the same way as responsibility, the mother concept. But today, corporate responsibility professionals are trying to move away from this old definition of corporate responsibility and talk about topics like sustainability and creating shared value. Because today, you have to be more proactive. There are problems in society today, in your community, in the planet, that will affect the business in the short term or the long term. And the business has to make the choice to address those issues. But do businesses really have a choice in this matter? Is it a real choice, or is it just a perceived one? For example, we talked about coffee. If you're a coffee company, then climate change is going to affect you. If the planet heats up by 5 degrees, you're going to lose lots of coffee plantations to that extra heat. So your raw material is going to become more expensive and more difficult to procure. So a few decades down the line, if you decide not to do anything about climate change today, you will go out of business. And then you have to ask yourself the question, to what extent is what happened when you went out of business your responsibility based on the decision you took or you did not take today? Another interesting aspect in today's world when it comes to power and responsibility is social networks. Now, when we update our status online, or we tweet, we're usually responsible for the consequences of what we write. But if I tweet something, then it's probably just a handful of people who read what I tweet. Most of whom are probably related to me in some way. If someone like Kim Kardashian tweets it, it's more like 18 million people sitting there waiting for her to say something. Now, I specifically mentioned Kim Kardashian because of an incident that took place a few years ago. As you may recall, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the US government put air marshals on all commercial flights. So these were people who had proper training and they had weapons. And they were put on planes to protect the people in that flight in case there was an act of terror or an attempted hijack. And naturally, it was very important for this person's identity to be secret. They had to look just like a regular passenger to a passerby. So, what happened was no small deal when Kim Kardashian got onto a plane that had Wi-Fi. That was a pretty new thing a few years ago in the West. She got onto a plane that had Wi-Fi, and she ended up in the seat next to the air marshal. Now, the air marshal, probably overcome by Kim's strong personality or her other traits, revealed his identity to her. And a few minutes later, Kim happily tweeted, "I'm so excited to be on a plane that has Wi-Fi, and I feel so safe with Marshal Jim sitting right next to me." Now, if I had tweeted that, not that Marshal Jim would have told me who he was, I don't have Kim's strong personality. But if I were to have tweeted that, only a few people would have read it. Kim tweeted it, and potentially sensitive information went out to millions of people and potentially endangered the people on that flight. But if there had been no Twitter, then only a handful of people would have heard this from Kim, probably after the flight had landed. So you see where I'm going with this. The power here lies with the celebrity, but also with the social network. Should a part of the responsibility also lie with the social network? We've been crediting Facebook, Twitter, and all these social media partly with some of the successful revolutions or societal changes that have been going on in the world over the past few years. Shouldn't they also get part of the blame in cases of abuse or misuse? And I'll tell you, there are so many more serious cases of abuse or misuse of social media than Model Kim and Marshal Jim. Anyway, so up until now, it might seem to you like I've been talking a lot more about how you're responsible when you do something. But naturally, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that you're just as responsible when you're in a situation when you're supposed to do something, but your choice is to do nothing. It's usually easier to do nothing, right? An interesting quote from Edmund Burke along these lines says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for a few good men to do nothing," which seems to hold those few good men directly responsible for that triumph of evil. And if we look back over history again, there have been so many cases where natural disasters, man-made disasters have turned into catastrophes where millions have died because a few countries, a few superpowers have been too afraid to intervene. But we can also relate to that on a much more personal level. How many of us have, back in school, been directly or indirectly involved with a bully? When a classmate was being bullied, and we did nothing to intervene, we were partly responsible for what happened with that classmate. Even sometimes years later, we were sitting there thinking, none of our business, no need to get our nose dirty, just sit by the side. That puts part of responsibility on our shoulders as well. A bully survives only because he or she lives in an environment that tolerates that sort of behavior. On another personal level of how we can relate to this, and a word of warning, this goes into TEDx teen territory for a few minutes, so bear with me. How many of us have fallen in love? When someone walks into a room and we get butterflies in our stomach every time we see that particular person, then if we haven't worked up the courage at some point to tell that person how we feel, we're responsible for all the magic moments that could have happened, but never did. True, in this case you also get credit because you never got your heart broken. But as someone who has got his heart broken at one point in life, and then found the love of his life, let me tell you that the lows of heartbreak are never as low as the highs of hearing that the person that you love loves you back. The applause goes to TEDx team, that was the TEDx team. So anyway, we have these concepts of responsibility, power, and choice before us. And it can get pretty scary when you think, whatever I do, I'm responsible. Whatever I don't do, I'm still responsible. There are all these small and big decisions every day. The big ones can impact my life, they can impact so many other lives. I'm partly or fully responsible for all that happens as a result of everything that I do. But I think this also gives us a sense of power that we should recognize today. In the beginning of my talk, I focused on the first part of the word, responsibility, the concept of responding or giving an answer. At the end, I'd like to focus on the second part, at least in English, the ability. The reason you're responsible for all the consequences of all the decisions that you take is because you can choose to make something else happen by taking another decision. With choice, with power, comes responsibility. And what a wonderful ability that is. Thank you.